Okay, this is part two of week 15's lecture on Veracini. So, Veracini describes the relationship between narrative and consciousness, and this is where I'm going to sort of pick up from the last part. But in many ways, we have to consider what, again, the settler colonial narrative is different, what it's not. It's not a colonial narrative of progress. And this is distinct because where the colonial narrative has this sort of natural arc, which in many cases leads to sort of like decolonization or post-coloniality, a trend I think that's pretty common in humanities and social science. The idea that settler colonialism doesn't ever have that arc is really important. Veracini uses the idea of a palindrome. For anybody who knows what a palindrome is, it starts and it ends the same way. Radar, for example, is a word that's a palindrome. Well, if you think about like settler colonialism as a palindrome, what Veracini says is that it's essentially a boomeranging arc. So as opposed to a narrative arc that has a point that begins and ends, settler colonialism narratives always tend to begin where they start, or start where they begin. It's a loop. And he describes this by saying that the point of time where the settler colonial narrative is ideal is post-settlement, but prior to the sort of like nationalized formation. It's the frontier. It's the settler has free reign to sort of like do what they would like with the land, with the people, before there's any like government that comes in there and tells them what to do. It's interesting because I described extraterrestrial films, but there is this always sort of like de-governmentalization that happens in extraterrestrial films where the settler has to sort of like work outside of the authority of the government to enact this like saving from aliens. And this isn't just in alien films, but it's a very common theme. If you look at President Reagan's speeches in the 1960s, when he wasn't even a politician yet, up until the 1990s, he really rejected anything that has to do with centralized government and was talking about this Wild West frontier person sort of mentality of thinking about economies and peoples, which is essentially just a settler consciousness, right? The settler consciousness is pervasive, and this narrative is pervasive. And I think that we see it as it's perpetuated, right? One of the things that Veracini points out very specifically is that the continuous repetition of settler narratives, whether they take the form of like television and film scripts, or whether they take the form of political narratives, whether they take the form of the stories we tell ourselves about other people and about ourselves and our own personal histories, all of these settler narratives reiterate a settler consciousness that is necessary for us to disavow any violence or any sort of like genocide, ongoing exploitation, ongoing destruction of land, that make it necessary for the settler colonial project to continue itself. A term that I use in my book is auto-produce. But what it is essentially doing is auto-producing the conditions for us to continue this lifestyle of exploitation of people, of native African and African American, Black, Latino, Latina, Latinx peoples, Asian communities, all of these communities who have never been elevated into this sort of like settler citizen class. And then, of course, the destruction of lands, the capacity for the settler to own and do what it will with lands, and the destruction that it causes to our environment are things that we are facing as a community, right? These are the two biggest issues facing our world right now, is our capacity to get a grasp on the environment, to control what the environment has in store, maybe even just survive it. And then, of course, the increasing white nationalism, the increasing sort of like anti-Black, anti-Native violences that are happening around the world. These are the same things that were happening hundreds of years ago as these settler narratives were beginning. And in my opinion, and I think Veracini will also agree, that because we have not moved away from these narratives, we continue to perpetuate those same sort of like population production and sovereignty production violences. We really should interrogate that relationship, and we should really break ourselves from the repetition of these narratives that are essentially just obscuring the violences that are the original genocides of the United States. I think once we do that, we can reconcile where we go from here. Veracini ends the chapter then by talking about how we narrate the end of settler colonialism. What will it take for us to stop relying on a narrative and consciousness that auto-produce settler consciousness or settler sovereignties? And then how do we move towards a new future where we can't necessarily just like go back in the past. We have to take what we have and build into a non-subjugated, isopolitical ideology, right? I mean this by saying that we have to break free of our individualism and our narrative that like somehow the U.S. is built on sovereignty and grit. Really, if we can admit and stop disavowing how these sort of settler projects came to be, and I include the U.S. as one of those settler projects, we might be able to narrate a way for the folks who have what we have in front of us to grasp a way that's an inclusive future for folks who have continually been exploited by the settler project. I think this is really important to say too. It's not that we need to like send settlers and Europeans back to where they came from. There's no going back. But we have to make really honest admissions to ourselves about how power has been distributed, how power continues to be distributed in our society, and how if we can break from the consciousness of settler colonialism, that power might be more equitable for all of us. So your question is pretty simple. Narrate to me an end of settler colonialism. As Veracini has in the end of chapter 4, I would like for you to describe to me one component of what it would look like to break free of the sort of like settler colonial processes into a more perfect future, if you would like to call it. So again, one paragraph, narrate to me one component of a future that is beyond the sort of settler colonial paradigm, and send it to me. It's been really great to interact with you this way, and I hope maybe you'll take a class of mine in the future. Be well.